And I think that the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves.
Bioterror there's always the potential for bioterror. How you approach engineered microbe surveillance mechanisms to determine if there's anything out there in society that could be used in a bioterror situation.
It's a ticking clock that's counting down an outbreak.
Well, the US says it's looking into what many have called a conspiracy theory.
It's a distraction not because it's not important, it's a distraction not because it's not a tragedy, but we really need to put this into context globally.
And I think that the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves.
溯源是一个持续发展的过程，可能涉及多国多地。我们希望各国都采取积极态度，同世卫组织等加强合作，推进全球溯源工作。中方将继续积极参与病毒溯源和传播途径全球科学研究，同。
The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson told a media briefing that even though China was the first country to report the coronavirus, but it doesn't necessarily mean that COVID-19 originated from China. Meanwhile, various state-run Chinese media outlets have been carrying reports in recent days stating that a number of imported food products from different countries were found to have traces of COVID-19, alleging that the virus may have entered China through foreign routes.
One thing scientists do agree on is that there is little chance this virus was released as the result of a laboratory accident.
You've probably heard lots of bits of information about coronavirus. Some of it's true, but some of it is so misleading.
I would like to assure you that WHO's position is very, very clear. We need to know the origin of this virus. But
the idea that it came from a lab is an accusation without any evidence, whereas there's plenty of scientific evidence which tells us that this is from nature, as is MERS coronavirus and the SARS coronavirus before it.
There's a third theory as well, that it occurred naturally but then accidentally escaped a Wuhan lab.
China has repeatedly lashed out at such claims. Beijing says there is no evidence that suggests the virus was accidentally released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and then into the human population, but some experts say it did.
The current working theory is that the virus originated in Wuhan, but there's still more to learn.
So we don't have a definitive answer on the chain of transmission from bats to humans, and it may take years to figure out.
But it will happen. There's no doubt it will happen.
This is where China directed the world's attention, suggesting that this Wuhan seafood market was the source of the novel coronavirus outbreak. CNN even traveled there just before the city locked down in January. Officials had shut down the wet market, and security told us to leave. U.S. intelligence officials tell CNN they are investigating another possible source.
A Chinese-language newspaper published in Hong Kong, Mingpao, and the British daily The Mirror explained Sunday that the Wuhan Center for Disease Control, or WHCDC, could have spawned the contagion in Hubei province.
All available evidence suggests that COVID-19 did not start in China's Wuhan. Chinese researchers said that coronavirus originated in India in summer 2019, passing from animals to humans via contaminated water before reaching to Wuhan. However, the World Health Organization ruled out Chinese officials' claims that the virus was traced in imported salmon had origins in Europe, saying that there is no evidence at all to back this claim. It is still not clear whether China shared the genome sequence WHO which is a key essential in the further study of the virus.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
It's a ticking clock that's counting down an outbreak.
Yet, it is the same spokesperson who last month floated a controversial theory, tweeting that it might be the U.S. Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan.
China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen.
China denies more than that. For months, the government has been promoting theories that the virus originated elsewhere.
Does the Chinese government agree that the most likely country where COVID-19 originated is still China?
实际上是前年下半年，新冠肺炎疫情呢在世界多点多地爆发，而且时间线在不断的提前。我想这个呢也恰恰给科学家们提供了更多的线索。
One of the pieces of evidence for that theory comes from this researcher, who discovered COVID in samples from Italian patients as far back as September 2019, before the first outbreak in China.
But if it is true that some cases were positive in October or September, it means that the virus circulated much earlier than expected and what known. And maybe it means that the origin of the virus was different. The only one thing that I can say, according to this kind of information, is that the virus circulated in China much earlier than December.
As the world struggles to contain the new virus, a new speculation from the Chinese scientists who believe it may have originated at a research facility not far from the Wuhan fish market.
Conspiracies have swirled around the Chinese state-backed lab.
The origin of the coronavirus, man-made in a Chinese lab,
where scientists have isolated the purest form of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 and keep it locked under the strictest of security.
In China, it rapidly spread around the globe.
Perhaps this is not the first time Chinese authorities have tried to shift the blame elsewhere.
While they say more research needs to be done to find solid proof, such labs are known to contain disease-ridden animals, including hundreds of bats.
Some people believe originated there.
So now we're going into the main lab, and inside this lab here is where we keep the live virus.
The live viruses?
The live virus,
so
yes.
The most dangerous things that you have at this facility?
Exactly. This is the virus that was isolated from the sick patients, and now it's housed in this lab here.
It's a ticking clock that's counting down an outbreak.
Initially, researchers looked for clues about the virus's origin at the Hunan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan. The market was connected to many of the early infections in China, but there is not enough evidence to prove that is where the virus jumped from animals to humans.
The intermediary animal is still a mystery, but some scientists suspect it's likely a scaly mammal called a pangolin.
Then the virus evolved, it mutated, it changed form, and it became ready to infect humans at a large scale.
How it got to humans is still unknown.
We do all of that. Having said that, the worst bioterrorist is nature itself. Nature is very good at evolving microbes to create problems, much smarter than any terrorist. So what we've tried to do over the years is to use the resources to a deliberate affront or attack on us with a microbe of any type, engineered or what have you, to use that for an attack on us in the United States or elsewhere using biological weapons.
The spread of this is really, really surprising. We've seen outbreaks in the past. We think we know what we're doing. And so for me, it's a really, really big surprise.
Why is it spreading?
The numbers keep on growing. You can see where this is going. We are paying for a hideous mistake.
So it seems that it's extremely contagious, and it's not airborne, but it is contagious.
The novel coronavirus is a zoonotic disease, meaning an infection that can jump between different species.
Both SARS and MERS are also examples of coronaviruses that came from Mother Nature. In the case of SARS, scientists believe the coronavirus came from a bat, then went to a civet cat, and then infected humans. And in the case of MERS, they believe the intermediary animal was a camel.
Humans have been fighting off zoonotic diseases forever.
If it were man-made, it would look like some virus that we already have in some laboratory, all right? And it doesn't look like any of them, because someone would have had to start with those and make this virus out of it. And so that's the key. We have no such virus that's close to this. This is completely new when it emerged and obviously came from nature.
One of the key factors in determining the origins of the coronavirus is finding the first person to be infected with it. But locating that patient zero is a lot harder than it sounds.
Wuhan Institute of Virology could have leaked the virus while it was carrying out tests involving Chinese horseshoe bats.
And then on top of that, we look at and we see this massive Chinese cover-up of destroying samples, shutting off access to databases, imprisoning journalists, silencing scientists. And it raises some really big and fundamental questions that must be asked and must be addressed.
While it's plausible the virus was leaked from the lab and contaminated initial patients in this epidemic, more solid evidence is required through future study.
Of all the gin joints in all of the towns in all the world, Wuhan was the one city in all of China that had a level 4 virology institute, and we've later learned was doing highly controversial gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses. And so when you put all of those pieces together, when you add information that we have about the virus that has the greatest genetic similarity to SARS-CoV-2, which is a virus extracted from a mine in southern China, and then we don't see any evidence of a transmission chain from southern China through these animal intermediate hosts that others have mentioned to get to Wuhan.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Still, they shouldn't be making excuses when people make horrible mistakes, especially mistakes that are causing hundreds of thousands of people around the world to die.
We've seen a rise in the West in recent years of radical right parties and leaders who challenge the former liberal consensus on international politics. Donald Trump is the most important example, but there are parties in many countries that share his views about the world. The central principle in their view on international politics is the sovereignty of the nation state. They see themselves as fighting back against the processes of globalization, which they see as having gone too far.
We absolutely know that we will have the evolution of a new disease naturally occurring that will impact society. And the reason is because history has told us that that will happen. I can't predict to you when the next one will be.
The more you know about why these spillover events happen, the better you can also check if there are countermeasures you can take to prevent such transmissions in the future. Right?
What do you feel like is going on in California over this curfew?
It's just the Democrats' way of shutting us down, and to the point that we need to rely on the government to survive.
Following the clues should eventually lead us to the origin of the coronavirus that has brought us a year the world will never forget.
It's, again, not so much the impact of the virus itself, but rather the impact of the measures that are taken to prevent its spread.
On September 28th, 33 million people had been infected with COVID-19 around the world. On that same date, we passed the milestone of 1 million deaths.
Because they're like the public relations agency for China.
Well, I think that where we are right now in science and molecular biology, and particularly molecular virology, and our ability to sequence and recombine and create various organisms in some respect, is that the best way to prevent a nefarious act is to develop a culture of responsibility among scientists.
We don't want to give the impression that we are going there to check something. You know, it's not like a control mechanism. It's more, as I said, a team effort with the Chinese colleagues to help identify the necessary next steps and how to continue.
I was just using logic. I knew that this was a bat coronavirus, as we were all learning early last year. And as someone who'd recently been in Wuhan, I knew that Wuhan was far away from southern China, where these pandemic outbreaks tend to happen, and where the horseshoe bats exist.
Forever.
Careful on the edge here, it's a long way down there.
The report penned by Bo Tao Xiao and Lei Xiao of the South China University of Technology, the research lab, which is only 280 meters away from the Huanan seafood market, kept disease-ridden animals, including more than 600 bats.
It got out of control, but you know, there's another case that how come they stopped all the planes and all of the traffic from going into China, but they didn't stop the planes and the traffic from coming into the United States and from coming into all over Europe? I mean, look at Italy. Look what happened to Italy.
Trump and Pompeo, they suggest that there is a link between the virus and a Wuhan lab. Dr. Fauci seems to knock that down entirely and has said that the science indicates it evolved in nature. Who's right and what do we know?
Yeah, well, it's very important to be precise about this language because they could both be right. They could also both be wrong at the same time.
That it possibly started in a Wuhan lab. Sources say it is one of many origin theories the U.S. is looking into. Chinese officials pushing back against that claim on Thursday.
You have to have some restrictions in the sense of you don't do work that could actually hurt people, in the sense of if you have a laboratory accident, you have to have the right containment.
As it raised the possibility that the disastrous outbreak could be the accidental result of biological weapons research. This comes as a renowned law professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, Xu Jiangren, is known to be missing after publicly condemning Chinese President Xi Jinping for failing to contain the spread of the virus at an early stage.
So if you want to make a virus, you can't start from zero. You don't know how to make a brand new virus. You start with something that exists.
Here's what I mean by that. The virus itself has been studied by scientists, including in the Trump administration under the NIH. And Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, has come out and scientifically concluded with a report that they published almost a month ago that it wasn't made by man. It wasn't a man-made, genomic kind of conception of humans. It was naturally, maybe brewing, so to speak, for maybe even years, if not months. Now, the question is, did it then transmit to human beings from the market, or were they looking at this naturally occurring virus in the lab and then either intentionally or through some accident release it from that lab? So the question is not about origin of the virus. That's not man-made. The question is about whether it was released accidentally or whether it was, a natural occurrence. And that's the question being investigated now.
There are some American researchers, however, who say that they have worked in this lab in the past and that they would be very surprised if there were any leaks because they've seen the level of safety there. And of course, Beijing gave a glimpse into its top-level biosafety laboratory in Wuhan. Have you personally visited the lab yourself? And do you, not believe what these American researchers and what Beijing has shown is enough?
So I haven't visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology myself, but what we do know is that when a U.S. embassy delegation visited the lab in 2018, they were aghast by the low level of security. And we also know that the Americans who partnered with the WIV and scientists even at the WIV itself aren't able to account for all of the viruses in their database. On top of that, we know that lots of level 4 and other level virology institutes around the world have had security breaches. So I just don't think it would be credible to say that we can rule this out because a few Americans have nice things to say about their Chinese counterparts.
I think what's important to stress about the mission is that we are not looking for a guilty country or something like that.
Holding Beijing accountable for the coronavirus. Tell us more about that.
China perhaps would have every reason to cover up if this terrible, deadly pandemic resulted from an accidental lab leak, which is bad enough, but followed by a criminal cover-up. I mean, that would be devastating for China, the authority of the Chinese government within China, for the standing of the Chinese government and China in the world. So we should assume that China would have an incentive to cover something like this up. And I'm not saying that we know for certain it's one thing or another. Maybe it could be a zoonotic jump in the wild. It could also very well be an accidental lab leak. But that's why what we need is a full and unrestricted international forensic investigation into the origins of the pandemic with access to everything. And China is not allowing that, and we have to ask why.
This country is very lucky, and I'm very lucky that I put the ban on China. As you know, very early on in January, we put the ban on in China, and that was a very early date. That wasn't a late date. That was an early date. Then we later put the ban on in Europe. And if we didn't do that, as Alex knows, we would have had a problem like you wouldn't have believed. We would have had a problem much bigger. But
the public health department in LA straight up said that they didn't have any evidence to support banning the outdoor dining. They just did it anyway. All this is that Californians have given Democrats so much power and control over us that they're just doubling down, tripling down. They're doing it to us, and we're out here and we're saying we're done. We're tired of this. The Democrats don't even follow their own rules. They're going out. They're not even afraid of this virus, but they're telling us that we need to be deathly afraid. No, we're done.
Meanwhile, life in China, where COVID-19 was first detected, is mostly back to normal, with some health restrictions in place. But after strict lockdowns across the country, people here are once again able to go to concerts.
It's taken almost exactly a year, so long in fact that Wuhan, the city where the outbreak began, is back to normal. People aren't packed indoors hiding from the virus. They're now packed in clubs, celebrating their freedom.
New Zealand declared itself coronavirus-free on June 8th and has only seen a handful of cases since, even allowing travel and hosting large events again.
Open those bronchial tubes and show me you love me! Touch me, Daddy!
Bats are actually a natural reservoir for many viruses. So the virus can actually replicate inside the bat without making it sick, and then the bat passes it on to other animals, and then finally that gets passed on to humans. And that is what happened in Wuhan, China.
Spillover events from animals to humans happen all the time.
When officials in Wuhan raised the alarm about a mysterious pneumonia on December 31st, 2019, more than 24 patients suffering from it had links to the city's Huanan seafood wholesale market. Scientists generally agree the coronavirus most likely came from an animal, possibly a bat.
So what are the scientific arguments that suggest this virus comes from the nature?
So every human virus that we know of, every one we can trace back to some animal that had it originally.
It's important to understand the origin of the virus for 3 key reasons. One is if we find the source and if it's still out there, we can prevent future reintroduction of the same virus into the human population. The second reason is that if we understand how this one jumped from a bat origin into humans, we can perhaps prevent similar events in the future, so to prevent future similar pandemics. And the third reason is that if we can find the virus, how it looked like before it jumped to the human population, we could potentially be in a better position to develop more efficient treatments and vaccines for this disease.
The initial contamination, she says, likely happened here at a filthy animal market in Wuhan, China. Someone there, she believes, butchered a bat, came into contact with its blood or urine, and then touched his or her mouth or nose.
But just how the virus jumped from animal to human is a key question the international researchers hope to answer.
Dr. Anderson took me to another part of the facility to show me where the virus came from. Bats gathered in China for food. A vet here captured one, and in a containment cage, she showed it to me.
And why bats? How confident are you that the coronavirus came from bats?
So I'm probably 90% confident that the new coronavirus came from bats.
Closest virus to SARS-CoV-2 is a bat coronavirus isolated in 2013. This virus is very similar to SARS-CoV-2, but it's missing some features. And there are two other coronaviruses that were isolated that also have very similar features to this SARS-CoV-2. So what this is telling us is that out there in animals, there are SARS-like viruses circulating. They have recombined to form the current SARS-CoV-2, which then acquired additional changes to be able to infect humans. So all the data are there. If you just look at them, you can see that the signatures of this virus coming from bat viruses are very clear.
He's just driven down, right?
Once you start being too restrictive, you then impede creativity for so many of the good things that could come out of the same type of work.
The names of experts have been announced, and I would like to assure you that WHO's position is very, very clear. We need to know the origin of this virus.
Tell us about this mission and the people in it.
We have put together a team of 10 international experts.
But after months of negotiation, China has said yes. So a team of 10 international investigators will come here in a matter of weeks and start looking for answers.
They arrived today in Wuhan, COVID ground zero, and will spend 2 weeks in strict quarantine. The scientists will visit the wet market responsible for the largest initial COVID cluster. Absent from the official itinerary, though, is this, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Researchers there handled coronaviruses in the lab, but have denied any possibility of a leak.
所以说他们这个点来的话也有一定的帮助，只是说来迟了嘛，来迟总比不来好嘛。对中国是最先发生这个疫情的这个情况的话，这个病情的就是第一地点的话，他来这个地方来找一些更多的帮助，肯定会给到他更多的帮助的。
This city of 10 million, where numerous cases were first reported, will be a significant part of their focus. Was this now infamous market the place where it crossed over into humans? Where and what did the virus actually come from? Key questions to try to prevent it happening again. For some, though, it's a blame game that's already over.
China's secrecy, deceptions and cover-up allowed it to spread all over the world.
China's already secured a significant agreement from the WHO. This is not a China-only investigation. At the insistence of Beijing, this is a global investigation, and it's starting in China.
And then on holding them accountable, is that something you prefer to do now in the next few
No,
weeks?
I don't want to do that. I want to find out what happened. I think we'll be able to get a very good, very powerful definition of exactly what happened. We're working on it strongly now, and I think it's going to be very powerful. But they could have stopped it. They are a very brilliant nation, scientifically and otherwise. It got loose, let's say, and they could have capped it. They could have stopped it.
The anti-globalism of the right means not wanting foreigners to interfere in the affairs of your state, and also not wanting to waste the resources of your nation dealing with the problems of other countries.
And what has been the role of the World Health Organization in all of this so far? And maybe you can give us an update on the status of the WHO's relationship with the U.S.
So the WHO is the essential organization for global health. If we didn't have it, we would need to invent it. And at the World Health Assembly last year, 130 countries came together to authorize an investigation into the origin of the pandemic and other things. Unfortunately, in the negotiation for the terms of reference for that investigation, China was given a veto on who gets to participate. And also it was determined that China would do the initial research and the investigation committee would simply oversee the work of these Chinese investigators. And now with all of the evidence that is accumulating, with all of the evidence of a cover-up, it's very clear, it should be clear, that an investigation that relies primarily on the transparency and goodwill of the Chinese government can no longer be considered credible.
And this group will travel to Wuhan in the coming days and spend probably about a month there working in close collaboration with Chinese counterparts.
On problems at home. So the radical right is instinctively hostile to lots of things that Western liberal democracies have long championed, like attempts to promote democracy and human rights around the world, or spending money on development aid, getting involved in overseas conflicts in the name of humanitarian intervention, multilateral trade agreements, and of course, open borders, which allow high levels of migration, which for the radical right threatens what they see as the ethnic or cultural identity of the nation.
Really highlights the interconnectedness of global markets. And I think it's something that we continually underestimate.
Right, so we have these three phases of the coronavirus. Where do we find those around the world? Are they everywhere?
Well, the A, B, C types are all represented in China and in East Asia, but we see early A types even penetrating to Europe, Australia, and North America. And then later, the B type takes over. So that happens in March and April. So it has developed by mutation a more infectious type, which has then taken over the world in the course of March and April. So we saw that coming up in February and March in our data.
And we're doing everything to make sure that we know the origin. And this is a technical issue. And I would like to say, some have been politicizing this, although we have been doing our best to know the origin, but some have been politicizing it.
The long-term impact of that may not be so great in the context of an economic downturn, but the interconnectedness of those markets is something that as investors and as market participants, we really need to keep an eye on, and the coronavirus is really highlighting that as a very important topic, as the trade deal and trade discussions did as well.
we know the rest. Outbreaks still spreading around the world. In South Korea, they're disinfecting public transport. In China, authorities promise to crack down hard on the wildlife trade. Security forces training to capture a suspected infected person, a sign of what could be coming.
Do you think...
Billy, listen to me, Billy. It's happening so quick, it's an epidemic and it's spreading. It's the big one, the scandal we've been dreading. Billy.
And we did some calculations to find out when that might have happened. And interestingly, the common ancestor between the bat that we have and the human coronavirus is on the order of 5 decades. So that might mean that the coronavirus has been circulating in some part of mankind undiscovered for decades. Just like the AIDS virus was not discovered until the 1980s, even though there were samples in the 50s now that we know about.
Coronavirus is a whole family of viruses that have little spikes on the surface that look like a crown, which is how it got its name. You've probably heard of other types of coronavirus. There was the SARS coronavirus, and the outbreak was in 2002. There was the MERS coronavirus with an outbreak in 2012. And there are actually a lot of other types of coronavirus, but they don't have special names and they just cause the common cold.
In the US alone, you see 60,000 deaths from influenza just last year.
The World Health Organization estimates that around 60% of all human pathogens have a zoonotic origin. And you might be saying, I've never heard of a zoonotic disease. Yes, you have, because rabies, salmonella, West Nile virus, Ebola, and coronavirus, this one, are all examples of zoonotic diseases.
Some zoonotic. On the bright side, the month of March was the first March without a school shooting since 2002, which is great news. Or it's kind of great news. Or it's not like really good news because there's no school shootings because schools are closed because of the corona. No, ha! Can't trick me into saying it. Not going to say it. Nice try, news.
A team of 10 international scientists is to travel to the Chinese city of Wuhan next month to investigate the origins of COVID-19. That's according to the World Health Organization.
Until we're stopped by the police, lying in wait for us. This is a system that doesn't care for questions. And it is one that the experts from the World Health Organization must navigate.
And I think that the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves.
So how does coronavirus play into this tension between globalism and anti-globalism? As so often in politics, we see politicians interpreting events according to their pre-existing worldviews and in ways that serve their political agendas.
The vast majority of work on that area will be done for the betterment of mankind. There are always going to be the bad guys around, somewhere, someplace. You would hope that they don't have the opportunity to do something that is going to ultimately hurt mankind.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can only work with parts that you have, right? You don't make new ones. That's exactly right.
Latest debate over the virus's actual origin coincides with a damning Associated Press report. It claims China sat on critical information for 6 full days, from January 14th until January 20th, downplaying the outbreak in public, before finally revealing the full scope of the threat.
Do you envision political or social fallout from suggesting that a Chinese lab is to blame?
I do. That's exactly why it's so important to be careful with that language between the President and the Secretary of State and Dr. Fauci. They're all saying something similar, but to be very clear, the fallout from a mistake or an accidental release will be, somewhat significant, but perhaps obviously not that level of war or conflict.
And that's why certainly the United States and other countries, we need to do all we can to support the World Health Organization. And as members of the world community, we all are stakeholders in asking some really tough questions about how the pandemic began. And we don't need to just point fingers at China. We need to point fingers at ourselves. China certainly has failed. The United States has failed. The World Health Organization has in many ways failed. We need to be asking these tough questions because for all we know, a worse pandemic is just around the corner, and shame on us if we're not doing all we can to be ready for that.
I think it's just going to become part of our life.
You praised China in the past, so what's changed? When you tweeted, China's been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The U.S. greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well. What has changed between then, when you were saying those things about China, and now?
Well, what's changed is the following. We did a trade deal and everybody was very happy. There's nobody ever been tough on China like I've been tough on China. I got elected, at least partially because of borders and military and different things, but one of the things I'd say is how China and other countries are ripping us off.
Well, in fact, the first genome was submitted on Christmas Eve, 24th of December. That is correct. But the first patients described with the coronavirus symptoms in a medical journal, in the Lancet, in fact, fell ill on the 1st of December. So inevitably, that patient must have caught it in November. And as for the origins of, or the theory that the origins of the infection started in the Wuhan fish market, I think is problematic for two reasons. First of all, as I said, the most ancient viral subtype is the A type. But what we found is that the dominant type in Wuhan, even in the early phase, in the first 3 weeks, was the B type. 20 out of 23 patients in Wuhan until mid-January have the B type, only 3 of the A type. And elsewhere in China, you find more of these A types. For example, in Yunnan or in Guangdong in southern China, where indeed you have bat populations, whereas in Wuhan you don't.
The WHO has tried before to do what China's President Xi Jinping did back in March and go to the streets of Wuhan. An initial team came in July, but they didn't make it beyond quarantine in Beijing. The full 10-person team hopes to gather samples here and interview some of the first known people infected. Much, though, will depend on working with their Chinese counterparts.
I think, of course. What is the latest then with the WHO's investigation into the origins of the pandemic? Is it on hold now?
No, it's not on hold. The team is going to be visiting China later this month.
Mishaps don't happen. But if it were intentionally released, it's not intentionally created, but intentionally released, that would be tantamount to the largest biowarfare we've ever seen on the planet. And so we have to be very careful to make sure we don't imply that unless there's pretty strong evidence.
The AP report is based on what they characterize as a memo from a January 14th confidential teleconference involving the head of China's National Health Commission. CNN has combed through the government's public report of that teleconference, which was released more than a month after it took place. It says a, quote, sober understanding of the situation was made known to top Chinese government officials, adding that, quote, clustered cases suggest that human-to-human transmission is possible.
Why do you think people keep inventing these conspiracy theories, even when scientists are continuously arguing against them?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the science is hard to understand for most people. When people don't understand the science, then it's easy for them to turn to conspiracy because they can understand a conspiracy, right? And I think the other part of it is that people want to put blame, right, for things that happen. So this is a natural disaster, which is what viruses are. They originate from nature. And many people can't understand that or come to terms with it. So they want to blame someone. So they blame a laboratory.
WHO's position has been very clear that we will start the study from Wuhan, know what has happened there, and then based on the findings we have there, to explore if there are other avenues that we have to explore. And our position has been very clear and very strong. And we're working to make sure that the origin of the virus is known.
For mainstream liberal politicians, coronavirus is more evidence that because we are more international and interconnected than ever, the only way to manage global challenges is through deeper global cooperation.
Dr. Fabian Leendertz from the Robert Koch Institute in Germany is on the team.
And so the big scope is to try to find out what happened, so how the virus jumped from which animal to perhaps an intermediate host and then to humans, to reconstruct this scenario.
And we suspect the 1918 influenza was an avian flu.
The 1918 flu pandemic is believed to have killed 50 million people and infected a third of the global population at the time. Though it was called the Spanish flu, researchers now believe it started in the U.S., on a pig farm in Kansas. Here's what some experts believe happened. A bird with the flu and a human with a common seasonal flu infected a pig. The two flus mutated in a pig and created a new virus.
Now, the reason the 1918 flu was so deadly, similar to this coronavirus, is humans had no immunity against it.
That's why understanding where the novel coronavirus came from is key to understanding how we got it. One clue might be in those spiky proteins that allow the virus to infect you. And these specific proteins work dangerously well and have never been seen before.
And this is important because this is why every single major scientific journal and authority believes that the virus came from nature and not a lab.
Reggie Aki, ABC 7 News.
While the seafood wholesale market was a hotspot for transmission, so far there is no hard evidence that links an infected animal to the market.
As hundreds of millions traveled leading up to the Lunar New Year holiday, mass gatherings at airports and railway stations, the Wuhan Health Commission maintained that the outbreak was controllable and preventable and that this was not contagious. It was not until January 20th did leading health officials acknowledge publicly cases of human-to-human transmission, and they even stated that medical personnel had gotten infected. CNN spoke with one of the doctors who early on tried to sound the alarm and contracted the illness. Wuhan ophthalmologist Dr. Li Wenliang was reprimanded in early January by Wuhan police. They accused the 34-year-old of spreading rumors after he had messaged friends, warning them of a SARS-like illness going around. Instead of listening to his warning, police silenced Dr. Li and other whistleblowers. He died of coronavirus in early February. CNN's early reporting also highlighted an underreporting of cases. Wuhan residents telling us that their loved ones were never tested, despite suffering from coronavirus-like symptoms. Instead, their deaths listed as severe pneumonia. Whether it was intentional or due to a lack of testing, for some, China's reported numbers of coronavirus cases and deaths does not add up.
Of course, and then of the third driver is political. Of course, we have individuals in the U.S. who have political motives to put blame on another country for this, another laboratory, and that drives them. I mean, it's irrational in my view. You should look at the science, but those are the things I think keep driving these theories, and they never stop.
And solve this on its own. It needs global scientific cooperation, free flow of information, and coordinated interventions to tackle the health crisis and support the global economy.
That means the scientists will have to work backwards.
So we are starting on the human side, checking if there are stored serum samples, perhaps swabs from symptomatic people from the months before the first known case. So trying then to see where that track leads us, if it's in another city or if it stays in Wuhan or where that goes.
I think there are better candidates than Wuhan for the beginning of the epidemic.
The mere fact that we don't know the answers, that China hasn't shared the answers, I think is very, very telling.
Because it helps the world to understand the genesis and prevent future outbreaks.
There will be veterinarians, there will be medical doctors, there will be epidemiologists, there will be virologists who are experts in these viruses. There will be experts in these type of diseases that originate in animals and jump to humans. And all together, we will work together with Chinese counterparts on different studies that hopefully will help us better understand this virus.
China has repeatedly maintained that they have been open and forthcoming in their handling of this outbreak. On Wednesday, China's foreign ministry said that in an open, transparent, and responsible manner, China has kept the WHO and relevant countries updated on the outbreak. But if the early cover-up and mishandling at the local level was in fact known by top officials, Their delayed action might overshadow the massive containment effort that China so proudly promotes.
Yes, well, the other point which is known is that if you look at the Lancet paper from January, it actually says that the very first patient who fell ill on the 1st December had no contact with the Wuhan fish market. So this looks to me as if the fish market may have been an accelerator, a catalyst, but not necessarily the origin there.
The WHO team will be scouring through hospital records for early cases that their Chinese counterparts might have missed, testing stored blood samples and interviewing the earliest patients. They'll also try to trace animal sources through the market, mapping supply chains and coming up with a strategy to test more animals. Chinese officials say that so far none of the potential host animals they've tested have had the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Right now, the best clue as to where the virus originated was found in 2013, in a cave in China's southwestern Yunnan province. Researchers isolated genetic material from a virus found in a bat in the cave. The genetic sequence would later prove to be 96% similar to SARS-CoV-2. But while it's the closest relative to the COVID-19 virus discovered so far, it's very distant in evolutionary terms. Evolutionary biologist Edward Holmes from the University of Sydney in Australia told the Post that getting to a point of certainty on the source animals means finding a virus that is more than 99% similar across the whole genome. And it's still not certain that the virus originated in China. Genetic evidence collected from a child who was infected with COVID-19 in Italy in December 2019 and from a man in France who tested positive in the same month indicate that the virus was spreading earlier than first thought. The WHO scientists emphasize that their mission is not a blame game.
I think what's important to stress about the mission is that we are not looking for a guilty country or something like that. Spillover events from animals to humans happen all the time, even here in Germany.
The scientists and the WHO are also urging patience as they search for the origin of SARS-CoV-2. It is a hunt for a killer that could take many years.
We have now the tools that allows us to look at the genetic makeup of these viruses. And when we look at our virus, the COVID-19 virus, there is nothing in its makeup that would indicate that it has been manufactured. It's clearly a natural virus, and there are many of these around. We have seen several of them in the past, so in itself it's not a surprise. Laboratory accidents happen, unfortunately, once in a while. It has happened many times in the past. And of course, it's even a remote possibility. We have to look at this as a possibility. So we will, of course, also look at that hypothesis among many others, even if it's an unlikely one. There is no evidence so far indicating that anybody was working with this virus in the past. There is no evidence to indicate that it would have escaped a laboratory in any way. But of course, we will have that in mind when we look at the origin of this virus.
So the big scope is to try to find out what happened. So how the virus jumped from which animal to perhaps an intermediate host and then to humans, to reconstruct this scenario. Starting on the human side, checking if there are stored serum samples, perhaps swabs from symptomatic people from the months before the first known case. So trying then to see where that track leads us, if it's another city or if it stays in Wuhan or where that goes.
It's part of the International Health Agency's hunt for the origins of what is now a global pandemic.
We've come here with a question. After all this time, after so many dead, how do we still not know where it came from?
Others are on the hunt for its origin. While the first confirmed case was in China, the exact steps of the virus's early progression are still unknown.
The believe a bat likely infected another animal before it infected humans. The intermediary animal is still a mystery.
It will be a long, winding way to the truth, and there is no assurance it will ever be found.
The UK's ambassador to China has spoken about her government's desire to see a shared understanding of the origins of this virus grounded in science. But at the same time, I've heard from very senior foreign diplomatic voices who express a deep pessimism about an investigation that they fear will be tarnished from the very outset by political interference from Beijing. The signs from China's state media are not encouraging. They are reporting heavily contested claims of COVID in other countries before it was here in China. One prominent senior reporter just today is stating as fact that there were cases in Spain in March of 2019. It's all part of an ongoing effort to cast doubt on the overwhelmingly supported conclusion that it started in humans here in China.
We should wish them well, but the problem is there are structural flaws in the terms of reference of the investigation itself that I believe will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get to the bottom of what happened. And that's what we need. I mean, this is very difficult. It's very painful for everybody. I am certainly not an advocate. I hope that this isn't a laboratory leak, because that would be a terrible outcome. It would be awful if almost 2 million people were dead because of an avoidable accident. But just like when a plane crashes, we ask the tough questions. Why did the plane crash? We have to ask the tough questions now, but we need the ability and the authority and the access to get to the bottom of this.
But I'm just curious to know if you think that we will ever definitively know the true origin of the virus, and how important is that discovery?
Yeah, I think that there's a good chance that we'll know. So if it was both naturally occurring, which it is, and naturally transmitted, let's say from the market down the street, we may never be able to prove that. There won't be a typhoid Mary, so to speak, that we can, zero in on and talk to. But if it was released from the lab in the alternative, intentionally or otherwise, we should be able to find evidence of that. I believe that's what our intelligence community is looking at now. You can talk to lab officials that may be disgruntled, doctors that worked at the lab that were observing their practices. One of the first key questions they'll have to ask is whether that lab was actually looking at and performing research on this virus. So we'll determine that, and then we'll determine through investigation. And if there is some link to the lab, we'll find it over time.
And we will not stop from knowing the truth on the origin of the virus, but based on science.
Their mission will start in the city of Wuhan, where the first cases of COVID-19 were reported in late 2019. But it's still not clear if the virus originated in the central Chinese city, or if it was brought in from elsewhere.
China has always said it has acted openly and transparently when it comes to COVID-19. Well, this is the sort of openness and transparency you tend to find when you come to these places. It's what any investigation into the origins of the virus is up against. More men come, more blocked roads, more blank stares.
Saying we're done, we're tired of this.
But it will happen, there's no doubt it will happen.
And these caves hide bats, and those bats carry coronaviruses.
Virus hunters had to sample feces, urine, and blood from thousands of bats across the country to find a genetic match. Hunting viruses is a time-consuming and expensive endeavor, and while technology has improved in the last 17 years, there still aren't many shortcuts to the detective work of tracing a virus.
It might seem odd that journalists find it so difficult to report on the science that took place in a cave somewhere down there some years ago. But all of this may be proof that China has now decided it needs to control anything that may relate in any way at all to the question of the origin of the virus.
Beijing's been reluctant to agree to an independent inquiry, and it's taken many months of negotiation for this access to be allowed.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has released its plan to investigate the origins of the COVID pandemic. The search will start in Wuhan, the Chinese city, where the cluster of cases was first identified, and expanded across China and beyond.
And now the virus impact on global supply chains really highlights the interconnectedness of global markets. And I think it's something that we continually underestimate.
For different reasons. Often international global elites are working to undermine the sovereignty and the will of national communities, and those elites include mainstream politicians in their own countries.
For shooting at the civilians. Yeah, it seems like something they'd do and be told and ordered to do to protect it from getting out, to stop the disease spreading. But that's also a known thing that secret organizations would do to keep the evidence hidden. If a place was riddled with disease like Atlanta, you would quarantine that place. That's what happens in real life. When a virus like this happens, you quarantine that area. When you start killing people, it's more because they're witnesses. When
OK。
不是我们的。
It's the big one, the scandal we've been dreading. Billy, something's in the air, and the public, everyone is painfully aware. It's the kind of story everyone will share. The numbers keep on growing, you can see where this is going. We are paying for a hideous mistake. It's a ticking clock that's counting down an outbreak. Every day another case, outbreak. At a terrifying pace, outbreak. When's it gonna stop? What's it gonna take? Outbreak. Outbreak, outbreak.
Sam, it's not as bad as it sounds, Sam. It can be contained. Simple misunderstandings. These things can be explained. No one would believe that these are acts we could commit.
Billy, time is up and we're in deep fucking shit. Deep fucking shit. Billy,
Sam,
listen,
keep quiet.
This thing is going viral. Billy,
Sam,
it isn't safe. You and I, we are caught in a terrifying spiral.
Sam, you play along now. Everything's at stake.
Billy, we you're never gonna cover up this outbreak. You've been hiding your disease. Outbreak.
I only meant to put the folks at ease.
Outbreak.
You're responsible as well, you righteous little fake.
Outbreak. 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 The children. Won't somebody think of the children? So innocent and pure, only in a world this shitty. How much more can they endure? There has to be a cure. Outbreak. It's a sickness, it's in my DNA.
Outbreak.
We're the culprits, and all of us will pay.
Outbreak. Our careers, must we go away?
Outbreak. By the way, I'm announcing that I'm gay. Outbreak.
Hey now.
One by one it brings us down. Outbreak. It's burning through the whole damn town. Outbreak. Now they've got us on the run. Outbreak. Can it ever be undone? Outbreak.
You.
A nightmare from which we can't awake. Outbreak.